Good morning, everybody. Great to see you this morning. Thanks for being here for this period of Bible study. We are studying in Genesis, and we're really just getting underway good. There's so much information in the early chapters of Genesis in particular, and we're studying in Genesis chapter 4. We're right near the end of Genesis chapter 4. We talked last week about Cain killing Abel and all the ramifications of that. Was our discussion right at the end of the class last week. The last part of chapter 4 goes into the descendants of Cain, and they're named there. And we're not going to study all the details of that. There's some interesting things. Our author asked, "What are the happenings and accomplishments of Cain's descendants?" We know that, like in verse 24, one of the descendants was Jubal. The father of all such as handle the harp and organ. Zillah, she bare Tubal-Cain, an instructor and artificer in brass and iron, and so on. So just some interesting details there those are probably some verses that you might get questioned if you engaged in a Bible trivia contest, but I don't know if they have a whole lot of ramifications in other areas. But at the end of chapter 4, Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son and called his name Seth. For God, said she, hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. And to Seth, to him also was born a son. He called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. Okay, so I think that's the significant development there, is that the third son of Adam and Eve was Seth. Now, we know that Adam had other children. As you get into chapter 5, it says, verse 4, the days of Adam after he had begotten Seth were 800 years, and he begat sons and daughters. And all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. There were apparently numerous other children to Adam and Eve. The ones we know, Cain and Abel and Seth, are the ones that we know. And of course, the lineage is going to pursue in the line of Seth. In chapter 5 here, the genealogy goes on to pursue the descendants of Seth. Now, there are some common names between the descendants of Cain and the descendants of Seth. For instance, go back to chapter 4, verse 17. There's one of the descendants of Cain is called Enoch. Well, we're going to see that Enoch was also the name of one of the descendants of Seth, obviously not the same person. And so there were some common names that were used. One of the questions that was asked, question 13 on your study sheet, I'm looking at lesson 2, question 13. Can you think of any possible explanations why people lived so much longer in the early days of the earth? And notice in chapter 5, verse 5, all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. Wow, 930 years, almost 1,000 years, almost a millennium. These early fathers, patriarchs, were living so long. The oldest man, the next question, who's the oldest man? We all know that. I mean, now talk about a Bible trivia answer that we could probably fire back pretty fast. Who was the oldest man ever? Methuselah, 969 years old. That's just incredible to think about people living that long. Why do you think that was so? Any answers, Tom?
One, they had to think about, the tree of life there in the Garden of Adam and Eve, and whether that had any ramifications.
Well, now the other Adam and Eve did, but the others didn't have.
Whether it had any effect on the hereditary things or not, that's one problem.
I never thought
We don't
about
have any
that.
record of any diseases or anything coming in and changing people. And
I would argue that that's the key right there, is that disease had not become prevalent, because really the consequence of physical death came to Adam and Eve after the sin, but it would have taken some time for a couple of things to happen. As Tom mentioned, diseases weren't were obviously not prevalent, and so they would begin to develop and multiply. Genetic malfunctions obviously would have been effectively non-existent. Adam and Eve would have been perfectly pure genetically, and so their near descendants would, obviously over generations, genetic complications begin to develop, but likely would not have been a problem for that reason. I think when we get to a discussion of Noah and the flood, I think there were some circumstances that in the environment of the earth that may have been protective against aging. We're going to talk more. We've already talked somewhat, but we're going to talk more when we get to Noah and the flood about what I believe was a water vapor canopy that enveloped the earth that would have protected the earth from harmful cosmic rays, if you want to call it that. So what I'm saying is probably would have been several factors, but I would hinge the biggest part of it probably on the pure genetic strain. Eric?
I think it was also part of God's design, so it was purpose prophets that just populate the earth.
I think you're exactly right. So Eric is saying it was a plan of God because the earth needed to be populated. And so if people just lived 80 years like we live and just able to have just a handful of children at most, it's going to take a long time to populate the earth. But if they can live almost 1,000 years and have lots of children, then the population of the earth will grow more rapidly. Just to repeat a point we made, remember, some people speculate that God created other people besides Adam and Eve, that there were other men and women who were also bearing children, and that the population of the earth grew because we only know about Adam and Eve, but there were others, which is not true. That argument, I've heard it made lots of times, but it's not true. You go back to chapter 3, verse 20, Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. There weren't, and it all began with Adam and Eve. There weren't other created beings that were multiplying, only Adam and Eve. So all the descendants. That also goes to the question, the question always raised, who did Cain marry? You could ask the same question, who did Seth marry? Well, they had to be marrying near relatives, right? And likely sister. They would have had to effectively marry sisters. And so, big problem, Well, no, it wasn't a problem then, for at least two reasons. There was no law of God against such intermarrying, which he would make a law about that later. For instance, under the law of Moses, there were strict rules about marrying near relatives. But there was no such law at this point. Plus, with the pure gene pool, there wouldn't have been the complicators that happen when near relatives marry now. Because our gene pool is corrupted, you're going to have probably some serious genetic misfires if near relatives marry. It wouldn't have been a problem then. So I think the easy answer to that supposedly impossible question is, who did Cain marry? He had Mary's sister. There wouldn't have been anybody else for him to marry, but it wouldn't have been a problem in that time. Tom.
Another concept that comes in. We talk about man living long, but there's no discussion of the animals living long either, and that goes through and explains a lot of things. You take some of your reptiles and things, the longer they live, the bigger they get. There's sort of explanation of dinosaurs in that concept. If you go through that, if man lived a long time, the animals have a lifespan with them as well.
Yeah, and there's an argument that's made, I think it's probably a pretty sound argument, but I don't know if you could prove it to someone who didn't want to believe it, that death did not happen on earth, man or animal, until after the sin, that this was a consequence, that the whole earth, when God was speaking to Adam and Eve after the sin in Genesis 3, Cursed is the ground, verse 17, cursed is the ground for thy sake. And so, that there was some physical changes to earth itself and likely to the plants and animals that lived on the earth as a consequence of the sin that entered the world. I think there's justification for that position, although it might be a little bit hard to prove it. We know that when God created everything, it was very good. At the end of Genesis 1, verse 31, everything was very good. Well, everything wasn't very good. It wasn't all good if animals were growing old and dying. And so you could make the argument that until Adam and Eve sinned, everything continued as it was after creation. Very good. Everything's very good. And perhaps even animals didn't die. I think there's pretty strong speculation there. It may be a little bit hard to prove, but pretty strong speculation. All right, so men lived obviously a very long time. Methuselah is the man of record who lived the longest, 969 years. Every once in a while you hear somebody say, because Methuselah's name is so well remembered, somebody you talk about a real old guy, and they say, oh, he's as old as Methuselah. Well, he may be old, but he's not near as old as Methuselah. Methuselah, 969. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time here in chapter 5 because it is that genealogy that follows from Seth. A couple of notable characters there. One of them is Enoch, verse 21, chapter 5, verse 21. Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. And Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. So Enoch is one of those not exclusively unique, but rather very rare cases of someone who did not suffer physical death, but was taken to be with God. Enoch wouldn't you like to know a little more information there? What about Enoch? What were some of the details there? Why was he such a uniquely good person that God would do this? We just don't know. We do know one other thing about him that's not even mentioned here, but over in the New Testament, in the book of Jude, in Jude chapter, obviously only one chapter in Jude verse 14, in Jude 14, it says, Enoch also the seventh from Adam. So that's the guy we're talking about, right? Enoch also the seventh from Adam prophesied of these, saying, Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000 of his saints to execute judgment on all, to convince all that are ungodly among them of all the ungodly deeds which they have ungodly committed. So on it goes. He was a prophet. We didn't read that in Genesis, but in Jude it mentions that he prophesied. And so he was clearly a man of God. God even used him to prophesy. Anything else? So what you got there, by the way, Enoch, his son was Methuselah, his son was Lamech, his son was Noah. All right, so that's going to lead us right up to Noah in chapter 6. But so Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah. So Methuselah would have been the grandfather of Noah. So you kind of see a little bit of the family tree developing there. Noah, a descendant of Enoch. Enoch was a good man, obviously a very good man. Noah would have been Noah's great-grandfather. But there would have been lots of other children and descendants of Seth through Enoch to Noah. There would have been a lot of other descendants, but when it came time for the flood, the only ones that are faithful to God, Noah and his 3 sons and their wives. So even in the family of Enoch, who was a very good man, there was still a lot of problems developing in the world. A lot of sin was coming into the world. And that's what we go to when we now go into chapter 6. Before we go into chapter 6, any other thoughts there on those genealogies? Tom?
One thing that you notice God doesn't get specific with everybody. He channels things down to a particular lineage. thousands of others that are, that are in there. We have a little brief thing with the book of Job that shows that in Abraham's time frame, possibly, you had Job who was,
faithful man.
As a peer of Abraham. So, but God doesn't go into all that. He goes through and he carries that lineage from Adam to Christ all the way through. And it's a very narrow band.
That's right. We don't have all the information. We just got we've got the information we need, and it's a narrow lineage.
And, there's a whole host of questions that we all have that we'd like to ask. That we don't have. That God didn't provide us information for.
Yeah.
And
we have to be content.
Agents have speculated and gone out with their theories and fables and things about those that aren't mentioned, but they don't have any references.
Yeah. And then are prone to build wild speculative theories. But what we have to be content with is we have all the necessary information that we need. We don't have to, if it's not there, it's obvious we don't need it. And we have to be content with that, although sometimes we're not very content. All right, so as we move into chapter 6, of course, chapter 6 begins toward Noah and the flood. Really important information. Verse 1, it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Okay. All right, so here, Tom was just talking about the development of sort of extreme, wild, speculative theories. Here's one of them. These verses we just read serve as the basis for one of them. Angels. So human women were born. Daughters were born to these men of God. And angels saw these women and lusted after them. And they came and bare children by these human women. And even to the point that there was something extreme or unusual about their offspring, the giants. And so the idea here is that the reference to the sons of God intermarrying with the daughters of men, that's angels having intercourse with mortal women, and they have, and the offspring of those marriages is even, or offspring of those relationships is even seen in the fact that there are giants among the men. What do you think about that? What do you think about that idea?
Jesus said the angels didn't marry, nor Satan married.
Exactly right. I think a very important verse here. Look in Matthew 22, verse 30. In Matthew 22, verse 30, Jesus was debating with the Sadducees about, is there life after death? And they remember they brought him the question about a woman. She was married to a man, he died, and so according to the law of Moses, her brother married, the dead man's brother married her to bear children to the dead man's name. But that brother died, and the next brother took her, and there were 7 brothers in all who had this woman as a wife, and they asked him, verse 28, therefore in the resurrections, whose wife shall she be of the 7? For they all had her. And Jesus answered and said unto them, Ye do err, not knowing the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven. And then he goes on to deal with the life after death question. But that's a really important verse in answering this speculative theory that the angels married human women. Angels don't do that sort of thing, according to what Jesus said. I think, let me tell you what I think is a better explanation to this. So, it says, the sons of God saw the daughters of men. Well, who would be the sons of God? Go back, we read this already this morning. Go back chapter 4, verse 26. In chapter 4, verse 26, to Seth, to him there was born a son, he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. Who would be the sons of God? They would be the ones who called upon the name of God. They would be the ones who are trying to faithfully serve God. We would use that same kind of terminology today. Who are the sons of God in the world today? Well, they're the people who are trying to live for God. They're the ones who are serving Him, trying to be obedient to Him. We would want to identify ourselves as sons of God because we serve the living God. And so I don't think we have to make any more out of that phraseology than is what is normal, the normal use of that phraseology. The sons of God are those who serve God. So the servants of God, or the sons of God, saw the daughters of men. Well, the daughters of men, or children of men, would be indicative of those who are not trying to serve God, right? And so what's being described here is that even among those who had been trying to be faithful to God, this worldliness became rampant. And even those who had were identified as sons of God began to engage in the wicked activities of the world, and their intermarriage with people who were not serving God brought them down as well. It got so bad that the whole world was corrupt and wicked. Only Noah and his family were exceptions to that. And so I think what we're seeing described here is that even among those who had up to this time been serving God, even among those, they became corrupted with the wickedness of the world. It was very bad. To the point in verse 5, God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So even the sons of God became corrupted with the wickedness of the world. There wasn't any left except Noah. I think that's what's being described there. Monty.
Well, if you think about it, when in the story of creation, God told everything to reproduce after its own kind. And we know that that's how it's just a law of nature. So with angels being a spirit being different from men, couldn't have reproduced with them to begin with, for one thing. And another thing that just hit me, I never thought about before, but as we read through the Bible, the whole entirety of it, every place that someone is referred to as being a son of God, it's talking about a human. Jesus is referred to as the son of God. He's a human. Adam in one of the genealogies is referred to as the son of God. He's a human male. And there's another place where Jesus, the Pharisees, was going to try to stone him because he referred to himself as the son of God. And he quoted a scripture in the Old Testament that referred to God's children, or the call out to the Hebrews being sons of God. So any place, every place that that phrase son or sons of God is referred to in the scriptures is talking about human beings. And so this should be a consistent passage with that, so it couldn't be talking about angels.
I think that's right. I think that's a good observation. What about the giants, though? Come on now. What about the giants? Doesn't the fact that there were giants, doesn't that prove that they were actually angels intermarrying with human women? Because there were giants after all. Monty?
Well, they mentioned in this passage, after the flood, there were giants too.
Exactly.
We know that Goliath was a giant. He had 3 brothers that were giants. Actually, that area of Gath was sort of known.
The sons of Anak in Canaan land were giants.
As time went on, that genetic trait apparently became focused in this family, and that's just how it came to be.
Right. So I think that's the answer right there. Any of these giants would have died out in the flood, right? But the fact that there were giants later in the Bible, as Monty points out, Goliath, obviously the most famous giant of all, but the sons of Anak. You remember when the children of Israel sent spies into the promised land? They came back, there's a wonderful land, but man, there's giants there. We can't take it, they'll kill us. We look like grasshoppers to them. So the fact of giants is not a proof that they were the descendants of angels, because these giants, this strain of giants all died out in the flood, obviously. Tom?
You know, tall people were sort of an oddity. I mean, I remember, you know, they talk about Will Chamberlain, the basketball player, you know, he's 7 foot tall, pretty close to it. You know, he towered above almost all the other basketball players of his time. Today, you hardly find anybody, you know, in professional basketball that's under 6'6".
Yeah.
Even guards.
Oh, yeah.
You know, so it comes into play, and you start looking at hereditary and selection and different things. You know, people, you know, tend to go in and have children and things that are like, look at your 3 boys. They're all over 6 foot. Most of them over 6'4".
Yeah.
I've got pictures of me standing downstairs by you and Joel and Jacob, and I look like a midget compared to you three.
Again, to this point, the giant thing does not prove that they were angels breeding human women. It's just that's a theory. That's a very, very common theory, but it's just not borne out by the facts. Tom?
All that, you know, if you study in Greek mythology, a lot of their concept is that you had Zeus and other quote gods that came down and had relations with humans and had these supermen that, you know, that went over, and that whole Greek mythology is built around that, and that came prevalent after you know, the flood. So, you know.
Yeah, and that's just further proof of the fact that men love to dream up, you know, wild theories. They just love to dream up. Okay, I really think that we have those first verses are just there to not describe angels marrying human women, but rather to describe just how corrupted the world had become. Even those who were trying to serve God had become corrupted now. The whole world is wicked. Dale?
If they were men of God, they would stated as men of God, or as some other persons might say, a just man. But just like Elijah never said to mention him, he didn't know God. You know, that was his downfall. He wasn't good.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch much of that. You said Lot?
Now, I say if they were just men,
Oh.
they would be men of God or
Right.
a man of God. The Bible doesn't ever state as any giant man of God that I
Right. Tom?
Yeah, we see this sort of this corruption of mankind carries on. There's a, you know, a little later on in the book of Kings, we have Solomon, who, you know, God gave him all sorts of wisdom, you know, and in his early life he followed God. But what happened? He married women of the
wives.
world, and he brought idolatry into the land of Judah
Yeah.
and Israel,
Yeah.
and divided, and eventually the country, you know, the nation divided over. So, you know, we see how that happens.
And we need to learn a lesson. That's another example of marry the wrong people, and it's a spiritually devastating experience. I think you're right. Okay, so it got so bad. You remember verse 5. Verse 5 says, God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I've created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. We were mentioning earlier, you know, the earth, the animals of the earth bore consequences to the sin that came into the world. Well, here's another clear statement of that. So God's going to destroy not just man. Man's the problem, but notice the other living things of the earth are going to suffer the consequence too of the flood. Right? A very tiny percentage of the living things on earth would survive the flood. They're going to suffer the consequence of man's sin as well. Now, back up to verse 3. So God's made a determination. God's made a determination. He's going to destroy the earth and the things in the earth. But he says, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. I think the right way to interpret that is that God makes a decision that he's going to send this judgment. But he said, I'm going to send this judgment 120 years from now, out in the future. Why? If that's the right way to read that, why would he say, I'm going to do this, but I'm going to do this 120 years from now? What would be the thinking there? Monty?
One prime consideration is that we're taught the New Testament, God's patient. He's not willing that any should perish, and all men should come to repentance. So he's given man time here to repent. We know in Hebrews, I believe it refers to Noah as a preacher of righteousness. So while Noah was going through the process of building this ark and all the work he and his sons had to do with that, it's clear that he was preaching to people and warning them of this upcoming doom. And so God was giving all that would an opportunity to avoid this judgment.
Right. So I think that's right. One of the principles of God is God's long suffering. 2 Peter 3 verse 10, he's not willing that any should perish, that all should come to repentance. That's true of him now. It was true of him then. And the verse I think that Monty had reference to is 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 5. God spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. And so Noah wasn't just preparing the ark, he was preaching God's righteousness. And so men were being given the chance to be right with God through the preaching of Noah. He wasn't just, building that ark. He was also proclaiming God's righteousness and no doubt if people had repented, they could have been spared. That's the nature of God. That's his long-suffering nature. So I think a very important reason why God would have said, I'm going to do this, but I'm going to do it 120 years from now. What else might have been a factor there? What else do you think might have been a factor in the 120-year business? Roger? I think that's true as well. That it may very well have taken Noah that long to build the ark. We've talked about this plenty of times in the past, but the ark was the largest vessel ever constructed in the history of the world until sometime in the 1900s. In the 1900s, they began to build these big super tankers that go across the oceans carrying oil and so forth. They're bigger than Noah's ark was, but it was only so it's only been with sometime within the last 100 years that men even anticipated or attempted to make a vessel bigger than Noah's ark. You're going to build this ark, and you're going to build it without modern equipment, right? You're not going to have the advantage of tools, modern tools. You're not going to have cranes and hydraulic lifts and all that sort of thing. It was an enormous vessel. And the possibility that it would have taken Noah that long to build the ark, I think, is not unreasonable. So that could have been clearly another factor. Bobby?
You say this preaching righteousness. Over in Galatians chapter 2, the last verse from chapter 2, it says, I do not frustrate the grace of God, for if righteousness come by the law, that Christ is dead in vain.
Okay, all right. Anybody else? Dale?
Greg, you mentioned the construction of the ark versus the super tanker. There's a lot that goes into all these super tankers. We build a lot of fuel tankers for our, and they're big fuel tankers. They've got baffles, braces that, it's unimaginable how to make.
Yeah.
But the construction there against what Noah built out of wood to be able to handle that. It's amazing.
Pretty amazing, really amazing. But that we're told that even now that ocean-going vessels are, we'll read here in a minute about the dimensions of the ark, but the proportional dimensions of the ark, we're made to understand that even the big ocean-going vessels today are still built on those same proportional dimensions. And so there was clear design here. Some of you have been, I know, up in northern Kentucky to see the Ark exhibit, where they have actually taken the dimensions here from Genesis 6 and built an ark, a full-scale replica of the ark. And I've not been, but everybody who's been says it's just pretty overwhelming, the physical size of that thing. I know Monty was recently up there. Monty said that one of the things I think that sort of frustrated him is that they took a lot of liberties in building the ark, because this is all the information. This is not a full blueprint of the ark, obviously. This is very sketchy information here. And so even the people who have created that exhibit, they openly acknowledge that they speculated on a lot of things that the Bible does not specify. They had to, sort of use their own creative imagination in that. One of the things that I think is about the ark, and we'll read the dimensions here in a minute. One of the things about the ark is, you always see the ark, and it's got big rounded. It's got like it's going to cut through the waves, and like it's going to go somewhere. The ark didn't have to go anywhere. All the ark had to do was float. And I think probably, how would I know? Nobody knows, but it seems to be that it'd be more realistic that you would have built the ark just like a big flat barge. Because all it has to do is float. It doesn't have to go anywhere. It's not going to be under power or under sail. All it has to do is float on the water. So if in my mind's eye, I think if you were going to try to imagine what the ark more accurately looked like, it looked more like a barge we see out on the Tennessee or Mississippi River, rather in size, in shape, rather than some kind of a vessel with a big bow and stern and so forth. Thoughts here, Dale?
Very good. Wooden boat, though, when you put it in the water, you just lose for a while. I used to have a big wooden boat. When you take one out or you put it back in, it's there.
Got to swell up a little bit. Of course, he's going to pitch it within and without with pitch. He's going to seal it up. Let's read. We're just about out of time, but let's read a little bit about what God told Noah to do. Verse 8, very significant. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. So among all the world, and all of the world, Noah exclusively found grace in the eyes of the Lord. But notice, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Grace is unmerited favor, right? So even Noah didn't deserve the favor of God, but of all the world, he's the only one who received that grace, because obviously he was a better man than, he wasn't a perfect man, but he was a better man than all those around him. You ever feel like in the world today, we're a struggling minority? Here we are trying to live good lives, but the world is so wicked, and sometimes I think we sort of get worn down. We're fighting a losing battle here. What's the use? Think, what about Noah? What about Noah? That clearly he would have had justification for feeling that way, but he didn't. And we want to tie in, before we read what he did, tie in Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11 is the chapter that talks about all those characters of faith. And in verse 7 of Hebrews 11, by faith, Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house, by the which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is by faith. So Noah was a man of faith. And faith, saving faith, the right kind of faith, is the faith that obeys. And Noah took on this enormous responsibility of constructing the ark because he was a man of faith. He found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Okay, let's read just a little bit further. Verse 9, Genesis 6, verse 9. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. And Noah begat 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make thee an ark of gopher wood. Rooms shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. And this is the fashion which thou shalt make it of. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. A window shalt thou make to the ark, and in a cubit shalt thou finish it above. And the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof, with lower, second, and third stories shalt thou make it. And behold, I, even I, do bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life from under heaven, and everything that is in the earth shall die. But with thee I will establish my covenant, and thou shalt come into the ark, thou and thy sons and thy wife and thy sons' wives with them. And of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark to keep them alive with thee. They shall be male and female. Of fowls after their kind, of cattle after their kind, of creeping thing of the earth after his kind. 2 of every sort shall come unto thee to keep them alive. And thou shalt take unto thee of all food that is eaten, and thou shalt gather it to thee, and it shall be food for thee and for them. And then a really powerful statement, very simple and direct. Thus did Noah according to all that God commanded him, so did he. He did it. And he did it as he was told to do it. Which is, I mean, I wonder how many sermons have been preached about Noah. There's so many great lessons about Noah. But, you know, Noah just did what he was told to do. And he didn't quibble about it. He didn't argue and say, are you sure you want gopher wood? I'm not sure we can even get enough gopher wood to do what you're talking about. I think we could use a different kind of wood. I think we could build it to a different dimension. You know, just all kinds of things he could have argued. Apparently, he didn't argue anything with God. He did as he was told to do, which is a really important statement. We mentioned, backing up now, we mentioned those dimensions, which are apparently very stable and seaworthy dimensions for a vessel. As we said, it didn't have to go anywhere. It just had to float, and it had to be stable and not capsize. There would have been a lot of weight in this ark. By the time the animals and all the foodstuffs were brought into the ark, it would have been a heavy vessel. So it needed to be stable and not prone to flip over, which again, a sort of a barge-shaped vessel probably would have done that in very good fashion. So we're just out of time, but the dimensions. The length, 300 cubits. Now, typically, we think a biblical cubit was the measure from the tip of a man's fingers to his elbow. And usually you hear that explained as 18 inches. But Monty, I think you told me that they went on a little bigger dimension than that. And when they built that ark model.
The display they had up there talked about the cubit and how it depended on where you got it from. It could vary some from as short as maybe 15 inches up to somewhere past 20 inches. And so I think they said the one that they used from was 20.7 inches.
Okay. So that's not an exacting measurement, but we understand that they measured this distance, and a good rough estimate is 18 inches, a foot and a half. So 300 cubits would be 450 feet long. A football field is 300 feet long. So this is 1.5 football fields long. And it's going to be 50 cubits wide, so it's 75 feet wide, and it's going to be 30 cubits high. It's going to be 45 feet tall. And again, if you wanted to build a stable vessel, those relative to me, you wouldn't have to make it that big, but if you made it on the same proportional dimensions, it would be stable. Dale.
Imagine, say God told everybody in this room, I want you to build structures that size. We can go on reserve. We say, how do you do it?
How can we do it? I don't even know how to begin. And where am I going to get the tools?
Look what we have.
Yeah, exactly. All right, there's a lot more to talk about there. Lord willing, we'll pick that up next week.